Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this 1-hour Carnegie debate, Good Cop, Bad Cop, Key Takeaways from Glasgow, during which we will be examining the results of the recent COP26 summit. My name is Richard Youngs. I'm a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, and it will be my pleasure to be chairing this session. The debate is taking place under the rubric of an ongoing project collaboration Carnegie has with OSEPI, the Open Society European Policy Institute. Just before the COP summit, myself and my Carnegie colleague, Olivier Lassard, put out a volume examining the EU's external climate security policies, in which we argued that the EU had made very impressive advances in its external climate policies in recent years, but still has a lot to do fully to integrate the strategic consequences of ecological disruption. So that argument is very much in line and related to the discussion we will have this afternoon. Copious amounts have been written on the results of the COP summit. More or less every article takes a glass half full, half empty approach, arguing that significant progress was made, but not sufficient fully to address the challenges ahead. This afternoon, we will try to avoid simply repeating that now well-established observation. We'll try and focus in our conversation to some extent on the international dimensions of what the summit's results mean specifically for the EU's own external climate policies. To help guide us through these questions, we have 4 speakers. We have Carla Montesi, who's Director for the Green Deal at INTPA, the Commission's, effectively the Commission's development aid agency. We have Mark van Hoekelen, who's the Ambassador at Large for Climate Diplomacy in the External Action Service. We have Heather Graby, who's Director of OSEPI, and my colleague Olivier Lassard, who's a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. We'll move into some specific questions later in the debate. Perhaps to kick us off, I can ask each of you in turn what you think in terms specifically of the impact on the EU's own external climate policies, what you think is the one best outcome from the summit and the biggest disappointment from the results. Perhaps, Carla, you would like to start us off.
Okay, many thanks, Richard. Just briefly, you mentioned the best thing, and we have many things that we can mention, but maybe just at the level of the procedure, because it's one element that is not very often mentioned. It's the completion of the Paris rule book. This Paris rule book will provide now clear rule for the full implementation of the agreement. Create some certainty on the rules that are in place, some exigence at the level of reporting, and this will be important because we can say that now we can rely on agreed framework that will allow also us to guide our assistance to the partner countries. So it's a long-awaited outcome, I know, but will really create some clarity and some more transparent rule on the functioning of the internal carbon market and all on the transparency framework. So it's something that in some ways good results. On the downside, maybe of course we all have expected more ambitious results on the political intention to phase out coal and also clear timelines for removing fossil fuel subsidies. So of course we have made a lot of progress in the dialogue on this matter. Maybe no stronger engagement so far. Maybe one other element that is a little in the downside it's the I would say when we look to the NDC and the strong ambitions that were indicated by the countries, of course we could have expected bigger ambitions. we know that we have at least 35 countries that have not yet presented their NDC. We have countries that have, we say, presented reduced the ambition in terms of gas emission. And we have countries as Brazil that have really backtrack on their ambition in terms of gas reduction. So the good news is that there will be the possibility for all these countries to come back again next year, but of course the global expectation is a little less than what was expected. The link with our external relation is that in any case, we are working with our partner countries in order to support them in the revision of their NDC. So it's a positive contribution from our side. And of course, we hope to be able to work with these countries in the revision of their NDC. Over to you.
Thank you, Carla. Maybe let's hear next from Heather. What were your high points and low points?
So the best thing that came out of COP in terms of how the EU, how the European Green Deal interacts with the world is that climate justice issues finally gained prominence in the COP debate. They went from being an add-on question of charitable donations to a much more fundamental part of making the global transition to climate neutrality happen. That showed the importance of the European Green Deal, but also the need for a global Green Deal and for the European Green Deal to connect with the global transition. And the worst thing that happened was the missed opportunity to send a really clear signal to economic actors that fossil fuel businesses will be going out of business. They'll be going bankrupt, so don't invest in them. Because every time the text gets watered down to phasing down rather than phasing out, and inefficient subsidies rather than just simply subsidies, it just sends a signal that there are a few more years of profits in fossil fuel extraction, which incentivizes investment in that extraction. So I would have liked to have seen a much stronger signal, especially because next year's COP will find it difficult to do that because it's from, it will be in Egypt.
Thank you, Heather. Mark, how does that resonate with your assessment?
Well, the advantage of speaking after Carla and Heather is that already quite a number of things have been mentioned. Let me add my perspective to it, which is, say, supplementary to what they have said. In terms of, say, the best outcome, I would say the sectoral initiatives that were launched at the leaders level. And if these sectoral initiatives really bear fruit, they will make a big difference, be it on methane, be it on halting deforestation, be it on the breakthrough technologies, be it on the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa. These are, say, side issues in the broader multilateral UNFCCC context, but nevertheless, they are very concrete. And if we can deliver on that, that would really be quite a step forward. In terms of the shortcomings of the COP, I think we had all hoped that we would have a bit more on coal. On the other hand, already in the first 2 days, at the leaders level, we saw that the global coal to clean power transition statement did not have a lot of success. And so we knew that the time for a strong statement on the exit from coal had not yet come. We have now this phase down of coal. That's something to build on. Is that a surprise? No. Countries like India and China still rely for 2/3 of their power generation on coal. So this is a very difficult subject. On the other hand, this decade has to become the decade of the decarbonization of power supply, because 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from coal.
Finally, Olivier, you've argued that the half full, half empty analogy is not quite right, that what the summit may do most importantly is kind of qualitatively change the dynamics behind international climate policy. Just explain to us your perspective on this.
Well, my argument is mainly that COP26 represented some successes in terms of processes. And the best thing that came out of COP26, at least in my opinion, is the fact that rather than pushing back the ratcheting up mechanism to 5 years down the line, we now have an appointment for a number of countries to come back to the negotiation table next year. So that means that for everybody, but particularly for the EU, there needs to be an onus and a very, very strong investment of energy into really supporting all partners, all diplomatic actors to find ways essentially to raise ambitions and to put in place some actionable transition plans. Now, this point relates also to the worst thing that happened to me, at least in my observations out of COP26, which is that we observed, it's been a theme for, throughout the COPs in history, but in COP26, the widening trust gap between developed and developing economies became extremely palpable, very heavy, and very loaded. And this includes the EU. So whilst the EU was perceived as one actor that was ready to step up on climate finance and adaptation issues, it was not perceived to be so on loss and damages issues. Essentially, driving back to Heather's point about climate justice, including climate reparations. And this is really important because it seems that going forward, we know that COP26 will be, the climate justice COP, and that the way towards actually raising ambitions and attracting attention towards more ambitious and implementable transition plans is actually to go through, we're going to need to go through the adaptation route and to really step up and foster a lot more trust and cooperation between the EU and partners all across the world to make transition plans a lot more tangible and a lot more concrete and fast-paced.
So I think your comments, Olivia, lead us into perhaps the next big question, which is what the summit means specifically for the EU. We debated the good and the bad in the summit's results themselves. I wonder, perhaps if I can ask Mark, first of all, following on from that, what you expect will be the biggest changes on the EU's own policies in the aftermath of the summit? What impact is the summit likely to have on the way that the EU pursues its own climate objectives?
Well, in terms of our own objectives, I wouldn't think that there will be a big immediate impact of COP26. I mean, we know what has to happen in 2022, and that is making sure that we get the Fit for 55 package adopted. We can only lead by example. Indeed, the ambition gap is still very much there. If we want to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive, we need to halve emissions compared to where they are now. The things that were pledged just in the run-up to Glasgow, as well as the things that were committed to in Glasgow, would bring us from, say, 50 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per annum to around 44 perhaps, billion tons per annum. Actually, if you want to really stick to 1.5 degrees Celsius, in 2030, we need to go to 25 billion tons of emissions. So the gap is still huge. We'll have to show the rest of the world that we are serious, that we are bringing down our emissions from 3.4 to 2 billion tons. But, just mentioning our numbers shows the sheer scale of the challenge in front of us. I mean, even if the US, even if the EU were to go down to zero in 2030, we would still have a gap of 10-15 billions to be filled. So this can't be done only by developed countries. Developing countries now represent 65% of emissions. So we need to reach out to them and then, of course, help them in their transition. A second thing, clearly, we have to work on more, and that was already pointed out or pointed to by Heather and Olivia, is there is the question of climate finance, where we need to see what we can do in addition to what we already did. The 100 billion question, I think, will now more or less be settled. Hopefully by the end of 2022, we will be at that level. But clearly, more will have to be explored. We will have to live up to this pledge that within the available finance budget, a bigger chunk will go to adaptation. We have promised that we will increase adaptation, or we will double its share. That is not going to be an easy task because, as you know, adaptation funding requires far more grants than loans. Currently, the climate finance envelope consists primarily of loans. So those are the things we need to do. Obviously, I would say in terms of climate diplomacy focus, the first thing we need to do is talk to what I would call G13. That is G20 minus G7. And see what they could do in terms of ambition. And then obviously we have to make sure that the high ambition coalition that was revived in the run-up to Glasgow and that was very instrumental in Glasgow is continued, and that we work together with the vulnerable countries, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation.
How does that relate to your assessment, Heather? Will the summit push the EU to upgrade the commitments it's already made, or will it ask of the EU more difficult questions about the way it does certain climate action?
Well, the EU has made major commitments, and I think the key thing that the EU can be proud of is the fact that it's actually engaged in implementing them. So, as Greta Thunberg put it, it's blah, 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 blah. Lots of commitments which countries don't necessarily deliver on. And the fact that the EU has a Green Deal where it's actually doing things in its own economy puts it in a different class of actor than, for example, the United States, where that's not happening because it can't happen because of domestic politics at the moment. It's for the Biden administration, it's primarily a foreign policy issue. Whereas for the EU, it's domestic. It's about industrial policy. It's about economic policy. That's where it needs to be. So I think the EU has already shown a lot of leadership by doing that. But when it comes to climate justice, we're still fundamentally missing a global, holistic understanding of the whole planet as an ecosystem and of there being only one climate. We can produce really beautiful green cities in Europe, but if we export all of our internal combustion engine cars to Africa, the emissions will still be happening from there and the climate will still be just as affected. If our car makers continue to sell internal combustion engines in China well after 2035, then that's not going to help. So I think we really need to think of it as a global transition. And this is where the European Green Deal's international impact needs to have a lot more focus. Now, in terms of climate justice, the focus at COP was really on the failure of the high-income countries to deliver on the 100 billion, and the progress was the loss and damage fund, which was not adopted in the final agreement, but it's there on the table now. And these funds for adaptation, they are important because in the end, the whole planet will have to change. We need a change fundamentally in the ecosystem, in the economic system as well as the ecosystem. And there needs to be behavioral change in all economies. But we also need to look at the fairness of the transition. Because if the transition is not fair globally, it's not going to happen. And that was very evident at COP. There were some very fundamental points made by Prime Minister Modi of India, for example, about the need to have a fair transition. So there's the historical emissions, the issue of reparations that Olivia referred to earlier. But there's also the question of resource budgets. Now, you may be used to hearing about carbon budgets, that per capita, the emissions of Americans are many times the emissions of Indians per capita. But we also need to think about resource use as a budgetary issue as well, because overconsumption in the global north is still driving huge environmental degradation in the global south, and that will continue even if carbon emissions stopped tomorrow. There's still major problems caused to biodiversity and resource use, which are the kind of Cinderella issues in comparison with emissions at the COPs. And we'll be replicating the same injustices. It's a huge danger that G20 countries as a whole are using 70% of global natural resources, and their per capita material footprint is 13 times as high as in low-income countries. And yet the poorer countries are those that bear the worst environmental damages from resource extractivism. And this extractivism is set to increase because of the shift to low carbon technologies. And this is something that Olivia has done a lot of work on, and which the recent publication that you and Olivia have edited on this is really important, because there are serious environmental impacts if we all just switch to driving Teslas. That's not going to be good for the environmental impact in the global south. So that's also a climate justice issue. And it has the additional political toxic spin that extractivism of this kind is essentially a replication of the colonial relationships, cause huge resentment in the global south. And that makes it very hard to get global agreements on climate activism, or climate action rather. And so these problems of biodiversity loss, water stress, and so on need to be really recognized for what they are, that they're a justice issue as well as a security issue, in fact, for the global north. So I think European leaders now need to look between now and the next series of COPs really into several things that we can do in the EU itself that would really push the global transition and would also make it more fair to the countries who've done least to contribute to the current mess in terms of emissions and resource use. So one thing is simply to factor into the EU's own economic models the costs of water and air pollution, water and food shortages that cause conflict, mass displacement of people, the effects of our economic activities in the rich world in poorer parts of the world. So the impact we have on biodiversity, ecosystems. And we need to move to the circular economy, resource efficiency and reducing consumption and the terrible waste that's caused by most production being based on virgin resources, 90% of material and energy value being lost after one use cycle. This is still a hugely profitable system under the existing economic model that's in place in Europe. We've got to stop ignoring all of these externalities. We're in fact losing more value than we produce. If you look at the UN did a very interesting calculation that if expressed in monetary terms, the loss of the economic cost of biodiversity and ecosystem services loss is about 10% of annual gross domestic product. So, and it also accounts for 30% of, it accounts for 3 times the global market value of agricultural products. So this resource scarcity and the need to not replicate colonial extractivist relationships, but to build partnerships that distribute value, the value that's created in supply chains fairly to the countries along the value chain and moving away from exploitative models. This has got to be a key part of the EU's international partnerships, its foreign policy objectives, and its thinking about the global transition. And I think that's where the Green Deal now needs to focus next in terms of its external impact.
So we've all stressed the intensified focus on climate justice, and Heather's talked about how this should prompt the EU to reconsider all its whole patterns of internal consumption and economic policies. Turning to you, Carla, I wonder what this increased focus on climate justice is likely to mean in terms of the way that the EU does external climate funding. What kind of changes are we likely to see in the kind of projects that you're running through ITPA in the years ahead as a result of the summit and commitments that were previously made?
Yeah, many thanks, Richard. I don't know, as Mark was saying, I don't know if we can talk about change after the COP, but it's clear that our engagement on climate are very, very important. From now, I will say that the European Union is the bigger donor on climate finance. As you know, between the period 2014-2020, we have engaged more than 23 billion of euro on climate. So one third of all the 100 million. Now, also for the future, we are really committed to do more. We have a new financial instrument. We have set in this new financial instrument, Global Europe, a very ambitious target in terms of climate finance. We will have more than the 30% of the total budget, Global Europe, so the budget that will be dedicated to our external relation, that will go to climate relevant actions. Now, this target has even been increased because our President van der Leyen have committed herself to put an additional 4 billion into this. So this implies that for the next 6 years, we will have 28 billion euro that we will use to support climate action. Now, at the moment, we are clearly working with our partner countries because, of course, you know that we define jointly the key priorities for our relationship, for our partnership. So it's clear that in the design of the future initiative, the future project, we need really to place climate as a first priority. This implies that we will have to design new intervention in the way that they could support this transformational change and produce, I would say, measurable results. We will have to target more specific sectors such as energy, transport, infrastructure, agriculture, forests, all the key sectors that could have an impact on the climate change. But this is a work that we are designing now together with our partners. Over to you, Richard. The sound is terrible.
It is, but we will persevere and hand straight over to Olivia. Who's been arguing for a while that at all these different levels of policy, whether it be diplomacy, climate justice, or funding, the EU needs not simply to do more, but also to kind of broaden the way in which it defines its external ecological agenda. Olivia, having made that argument, what are the improvements you think are most essential that the EU needs to introduce on the back of the summit? I appreciate the summit in itself may not be the absolute game changer, that it's coming on top of a whole set of pre-existing EU commitments, but if it is to act as a kind of catalyst for improvements in external policy, what are the kind of indicators, the improvements to which we should be looking?
So I think you're right to frame it as a catalyst. And I think that we should understand the conversation in two different ways, right? To my understanding, COP26 represented a different set of dynamics because of two issues. One is indeed, as Heather was saying, climate justice, featuring very strongly on the adaptation conversation, which needs to take more preeminence going forward. And as Mark was saying, we're also entering, or we have entered, the critical decade of decisive action, or in other words, the decade of implementation. So we are now switching gears in terms of climate diplomacy, and this needs, or this should be reflected in the way that the EU engages with the world. For a number of years, climate diplomacy was essentially geared towards raising ambitions, and it was a number of different, portfolios sort of under the umbrella of climate diplomacy. Now we need to enter essentially into a climate diplomacy which is multidimensional, multi-scale, and also multi-historical timelines. We need to focus obviously on raising ambitions. This still stands because otherwise we wouldn't be, we would need to come back next year to the negotiation table to ratchet up ambitions. But we also need to focus on what adaptation looks like in a climate disrupted world. And we also need to, develop new kinds of partnerships, as Heather was saying, with a number of countries in the world. So I think that there is very much, this notion that as much as the EU is one of the most accomplished regions or actors when it comes to having transition plans in place that are now going through legislative and negotiable sort of processes, we should not mistake the conversation for we've done our part. Because at the end of the day, the Green Deal will only acquire a diplomatic and external dimension once we recognize essentially the number of different situations of different regions into the world, and how the EU can indeed accelerate on its own ambitions, accelerate on its own implementation alongside other actors, because this is essentially a game or a race where, you know, the more people accelerate in ambitions, the more there are breakthroughs in technologies and partnerships, the more it's going to benefit everybody collectively. But there is also a need essentially to really try and understand that the EU needs an external dimension of its Green Deal, understanding that a lot of its pollution and greenhouse gases also get transferred through supply chains and outsourced, therefore, to countries outside. So there is a need to look at transitions from a systems perspective, a systemic lens perspective, to really sort of work through what kind of supply chains are going to usher supply chain transitions are going to usher us into an ecological transition, not just a decarbonized transition. How the EU can work with a number of different countries across the world to make that happen in developed economies, but also in developing ones, and how to put an onus indeed in terms of what are the packages around adaptation that need to be put in place. It's not just a question, and I heard that very powerfully at COP as well. Yes, the finance question is extremely important, but it's not just about how to top up on millions and billions. It's about what do we use these funds for? Do we know what really adaptation looks like in a climate disrupted world? How is it adaptable from one, ecosystem to the other, one region to the other, one country to the other? So all of these, there's a dearth of research, or at least it's not very visible in the conversations at Glasgow. We're not, very impressive in that regard, on how to, increase the portfolio of climate diplomacy, which drives back to how the EU sort of considers what is climate diplomacy. It's not just Green Deal external implementation. It's how do we rethink relationships in the face of the urgency to decarbonize, as well as being able to usher into a world which is also ecologically more focusing on more integrity. And I can speak about that in a bit later as well.
Some quite punchy suggestions. Maybe we get responses to those from our two policymakers, from Mark and Cara. But Mark, if the EU is to develop a more broadly defined kind of systemic climate diplomacy, is that feasible? How can we actually do that in trying to develop these next generation external partnerships with third countries? What kind of leverage, what tools does the EU have to actually implement those kind of partnerships, and what should they actually contain? I mean, do you buy Olivier's argument that we should and can actually change the way that the EU structures these strategic partnerships around the world?
Well, of course, only the future will tell whether we'll be able to do that. It's a pretty tall order. You also have to have the reality check, on climate diplomacy in the European Union. If I take the Commission and the European External Action Service together, we are perhaps, say, 7 or 8 full-time equivalents. That is EU climate diplomacy. So let us not delude ourselves. We don't have an army. Having said that, I buy a lot of the points that Olivia was making. First, implementation is now of the essence. We've got to halve emissions by 2030. That's going to be an incredibly difficult task. Even in the EU, let us not kid ourselves. For in the next 9 years, we'll have to cut emissions as much as we did in the last 30 years. So that gives you a flavor of the challenges ahead. Now, I think Olivia is right that we need to get into an operational sort of partnership with a number of countries, which is why the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa is actually has a significance beyond South Africa. If this goes well, this could become a template for cooperation with other emerging developing countries that are very coal reliant. I mean, there are quite a number of them in Asia. We need to see whether this partnership works and whether we can replicate it elsewhere. If you look at what we've done for methane, which is, methane is the fastest and cheapest way to slow down global warming. Well, we have now this global methane pledge where 100 countries come together, and where together we will see, together with the technical expertise that we can mobilize, what we can do in the field of fossil fuels, in the field of agriculture, in the field of waste, in order to get those emissions down. What is also important is that we really start unpacking this question of climate finance. I mean, in Glasgow, there was a lot of talk on climate finance, on loss and damage. We have to make sure that this does not become a totemic discussion, which creates much more heat and light. Climate finance is important, but it is indeed something that think tanks and others should spend more time on. To answer questions like, what is climate finance? Secondly, where should this climate finance go? Thirdly, how do you measure the impact of climate finance? These are all issues that we really need to look into before we can take this discussion further in a meaningful way. So, yes, there is a lot of work ahead. The climate finance issue in COP27 will loom very large. So we've got to prepare ourselves. We've also got to look into perhaps new sources of finance. There is this interesting idea of trying to mobilize the special drawing rights of the IMF for the purpose of climate finance. Lots of ideas, but they really now have to be deepened.
Which I think provides a nice link back to Carla. Just before you come in, Carla, we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'd encourage participants, people listening in, to submit their questions either on YouTube or through Twitter. Please do let us know what's on your mind. Carla, how do you respond to Mark's suggestions, and also the suggestion that it's not simply a matter of doing kind of more climate financing, but reassessing what it really means, what it should look like? I wonder if there's things that the EU has been supporting under the guise of climate finance in the past that perhaps it should not be doing in the future. What ways specifically should we be changing the way that climate projects are actually funded?
Okay, many thanks, Richard. And start me to say that myself too, I buy a lot of what Olivia was saying. Of course, we mentioned the funds, the euro that we are engaging into this, because it's also a key question from our partners. But really on the content, I think we have already mentioned different activities and the policy. Let me come once again to this phase out coal, or in removing of fossil fuel subsidy, or allow me just to say that we have clearly listened in Glasgow all the signals that were done by the parties about their direction on the energy or on the decarbonization policies. Now, it's clear that in our external relation, we'll work on this domain. And it's just not about having the Green Deal applied in the other countries, but I think there is a need to, in some way, to work with our partners in order to promote the implementation of this green energy transition. It's something that is very, very important. We need to work with them, we need to persuade the partners, we need to substantiate with economic arguments, we need to demonstrate that this green transition can work, also take into account the socio-economic opportunities that this will create. So there is a strong work that we want to do to accompany this countries, also with all the tools that we have available in our external partnership. Could be technical assistance to support, to increase the capacity, technical assistance to support policy reform, but also using our budgetary support to really engage our partners in taking the appropriate reform that will be necessary. Richard, you mentioned also one other question that is linked to what to do more. And allow me to say that on doing something more, we clearly know now that, just public finance will not be enough to achieve the global finance engagement that we have all taken. So it's clear that we need to encourage the private sector also to come in this challenge, and the private sector could be a crucial actor in this game. So what we want to do more compared to the past is really to increase the effort to leverage private finance. This implies that in the new global Europe, for example, we have foreseen new financial instruments like blending, like guarantees, that in some way will incentivize the intervention of the private sector, also in all the adaptation investment that could be necessary. So we really wanted to use some new financial instrument to leverage the private finance for adaptation. And this is something new that we want really to improve for in the future years. Over to you.
Very, very interesting. Clearly of key importance. Olivia wanted to come in response to your comments, I think. Then I want to turn back to Heather just to wrap us up on the issue of climate justice. And we have a couple of questions in the chat related to that. Olivia?
Yes, thank you. Just driving back on this point that we need to think in terms of climate diplomacy as more than raising ambitions and really sort of looking towards the implementation phase now. We need to also be conscious, particularly in the EU, that we're going to have to mitigate the effects of mitigation. Because the reality is that as part of the decarbonization and digital transition, we're going to rely on critical materials that the EU has identified and which the EU is resource poor with, for the most part. We're talking about rare earths, we're talking about cobalt, about lithium. There are some deposits in Europe, but not a vast concentration. And outside of China, these resources are actually mostly concentrated in two critical areas. One is conflict and fragile zones, which, if competition heightens, and the International Energy Agency tells us that there's likely to be at the very least a 6-fold increase in the competition for critical materials such as lithium over the next decade. So if the competition really increases for these materials, and it will, it is likely to have some adverse effects in terms of strengthening predatory economics and predatory political systems in conflict and fragile zones. So this is something that the EU is very much needs to prepare for, and to really anticipate in terms of what types of efforts, investments, finance, in terms of governance, in terms of civil society strengthening we need to have. But then there is another tension as well, which is very difficult to reconcile, which is that outside of China, these materials are also located in the undergrounds of the very natural ecosystems that help to regulate the global climate regime. We're talking about the Congo Basin, we're talking about the Amazon, we're talking about Myanmar. And all of these places are the exact places that fall under the new pledge around, stopping deforestation, that are considered carbon sinks, and therefore, play into the offsetting strategies as part of the net zero transition. And this is a conversation that is largely absent in general at COPs, but also in the conversations about how a transition which is green, which is digital, is possible, and it's possible collectively. Yes, of course it's possible. And yes, of course it needs to happen, because the urgency is to decarbonize. But we also need to sort of start working on a narrative that recognizes that there are tensions within the way in which we associate economic growth with decarbonization, with a new digital, industrial revolution, which will have some significant impacts in terms of ecological disruptions, water scarcity, environmental pollution, potentially conflict or violence, as well as social tensions, and dispossession of certain land areas out of their traditional guardians. We're talking about indigenous communities and environmental activists. So all of these different conversations also need to happen, and the EU has a very, very strong, comes under a lot of pressure, and also has a very strong opportunity to really invest new partnerships with value propositions that really bring to the fore this notion that, as Heather was saying, a decarbonization transition will need to be thought through collectively, or it will fail. And this is, why the imperative of climate diplomacy. I understand that there are caveats, and I understand that there is a reality check in place. There's a question of staffing, there is a question of capacity, but we should, when we start engaging with those tensions, when we start engaging with those fundamental issues, it needs to raise some alarm bells within EU member states and within the EU institutions about what type of capacity we need to change in terms of analytics, in terms of foresight, in terms of scenario building, in terms of economic modeling, in terms of diplomatic outreach through delegations, and through, the people who are working on climate diplomacy from within the EU institutions and from the EU member states as well. So we're talking about a reshuffling, essentially, of different priorities, which we should make sure that they do not compete. Mitigation, adaptation, conflict resolution, protection of ecological systems, rebuilding ecological integrity as part of climate diplomacy. All of these need to be part of the way in which we usher into this decade of implementation. And that will make the difference between a transition which is collectively successful, but also really ambitious in terms of raising down to 1.5 if it remains possible.
So the issue of the tensions is exactly the question I wanted to put to Heather for a concluding comment before we go to the questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. Heather, I guess the question is, and this is my also paraphrasing a couple of other questions in the chat, the EU may be upping its game on climate justice, maybe funding a lot of good work on climate justice, but how do we ensure that its commercial policies, its trade policies, its kind of geo-economic search for safe access to critical materials and many other elements actually don't undo all that good work? And I wonder how that relates to Carla's very important point that this isn't simply about exporting the Green Deal. I suspect many people in other countries would say that elements of the Green Deal may be entirely appropriate for Europe, but may not actually suit well the context in which they are functioning. And then there may be a danger there. How would you pick those elements up in terms of what kind of really effective approach the EU needs if it's to be successful on these climate justice issues?
Well, yes, I think Carla's point is very fundamental regarding you can't replicate the Green Deal. And yet, EU also has to recognise that it is setting global norms. Sorry, the sound seems really bad still. I've changed microphones. As the first big mover in actually implementing climate commitments, the EU is inevitably setting the norms that other countries and regions will follow. So just as with GDPR on data protection, where other countries took the EU's law as a reference point, as a sort of norm to look at when they were devising their own data protection law, we have to think about how the Green Deal will be seen in other regions. And it's terribly important that the European Union makes a success of it to encourage other regions to go in the same direction. But clearly, it can't just be replicated because it's designed for an advanced industrialized economy and one where there are sort of resources and state capacity which you don't necessarily find in the rest of the world. So I think those are key questions. What's the export model of the European Green Deal? How can the EU consider how to do that? And I think there are two issues that are currently on the table for policymaking. Sorry, the echo is really to get rid of it. So one of those is supply chain accountability, where the Commission is now working on due diligence in the supply chain with a directive like coming. We look at both human rights in the supply chain and also environmental impact. It's really important to get that right. It's difficult because there are different legal bases facing these things, but this is particularly factual in the supply chain globally that abuse of both nature and human beings happen. And by pushing the private sector to take responsibility for the whole supply chain, that's one way to issue that we want to about cooperation with China and the question of responsibility of the green sector.
Okay.
Sound is so awful. Perhaps I should finish there.
Thanks, Heather. When we come back to you, might need to come a little closer to the mic and perhaps just not use the headphones. Thanks to all of you. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to select 2 or 3 questions to put to all of you to conclude the session. There's one specifically from Rafael Argas for you, Mark, if you can elaborate a bit more on your G13 point. And then to all of you, there's several questions about China, how the EU, predictably perhaps, how the EU can actually develop an effective climate cooperation with China, and in particular, if developing that climate cooperation with China will involve or should involve sidelining all other kinds of concerns, particularly to do with human rights. So perhaps we'll start with you, Mark, on the China point, but also specifically on this G13 point as well.
Thank you, Richard. On G13, I mean, in a way, the arithmetic is very simple. If we want to get to 25 billion tons in 2030, there's still, as I said before, 15 billion to be closed. Most G7 countries, I'm not going to go into details, but I would say that most G7 countries now have targets for 2030 that are broadly compatible with the Paris Agreement. There are quite a number of other countries that have targets that are not yet compatible with the Paris Agreement, well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally 1 degree Celsius. So these countries that are not yet in line with the Paris Agreement should step up. And many of them are in G20, but not G7. So those we need to reach out to. I don't need to tell you who they are. You can look at the list yourself. On the question of China, the good thing that has happened in the run-up to Glasgow and as a result of the China-US statement that was delivered in Glasgow is that China has now indeed accepted that we can or we need to talk climate, even though on quite a number of other files, be it Hong Kong, be it Taiwan, be it human rights, clearly we are in a very difficult conversation. But China has accepted that we need to work on climate together. China has said that 1.5 degrees should be kept alive. China has made a number of commitments. Clearly, we'd love China to do more than what Xi Jinping has said in September. And we hope that next year China will revisit its NDCs again. So the good news is, I think, that China wants to collaborate on climate, but of course we have to look into the detail of this general positive attitude.
Does anybody else want to come in on China very briefly? We are running out of time, and I do want to get one other concluding question in. Olivia?
Very quickly, just a remark. On the day that the US and China agreement was announced, on the very morning, the Chinese climate envoy made his only and exclusive appearance at the side event venue in COP at the Danish pavilion. And it was essentially, the climate envoy was announcing a number of different areas that China will be working on. And it was a very, very strong symbolism that he decided to appear at the Danish pavilion, one of the EU member states, in order to make that kind of announcement. So once again, it shows essentially that the EU has this potential to become a sort of power broker or climate broker, however you want to call it, going forward, trying to deepen its relationships with China, but also essentially try to de-escalate geopolitical tensions that will work towards more climate ambitions and more cooperation in the next few years.
Heather O'Connor? Heather?
Yeah, it's really important. That the
I
EU
think nothing to add, and I love this.
Okay, Heather, let's just hear from you briefly. Then one more final question.
One comment. I mean, it's really good that there was this US-China statement, just the fact that it existed at all, even if it didn't contain anything new. And the key thing that Europe can work on with China is commitments that won't be overturned by one election or another. The thing the EU is good at is long-term planning and long-term delivery on commitments. In the US, one election can change everything, and you might end up without Senate ratification, as happened with Kyoto, whereas the EU is better at delivery. And so I think that's something where there's a sort of long-term planning element to something that could move ahead. And I think that's especially important on the issue of coal, because that's really the key question in China.
Okay, we really are running out of time, but we have a really nice concluding question from Abraham Joseph, who asks what the next COP in Egypt should focus on, what kind of leverage will be put on countries to report on the commitments they've made at Glasgow. Perhaps just very briefly, each of you could select a few highlights that you think the next summit should focus on, and perhaps we'll start with you, Carla, on this one. Carla, did you have any reflections on the next COP summit? Carla may not be hearing me. Olivia?
So a number of things. As I mentioned, I believe that COP27 will be the climate justice COP. So lots of conversations will need to be, attached to that, with a very, very strong focus, once again, on raising the profile for adaptation, not just in terms of finance, but in terms of what adaptation looks like in a climate disrupted world. That requires a lot more research, and there can be a lot of work, building upon. There was the launch of the Adaptation and Resilience Alliance, I believe, at COP26, spearheaded by the UK, which is, really building upon a network of scientists and researchers across the world. There can be a lot of work, a lot of profiled work, building upon this. The other thing is nature-based processes and nature-based solutions. Nature was part of the conversation at COP26, much more than before, but it needs to take a lot more preeminence if we really need to think in terms of the transitions in ecological terms, not just decarbonized terms. Then there is the question, as Mark was alluding to, finance and systems reforms around financial and economic institutions. This is really important because it holds essentially a number of keys to unlock systemic benefits in the transition. And building upon the methane pledge of COP26, Egypt will strongly benefit from focusing also on food systems reform as part of a response within the climate transition, not just, tagging agriculture or food systems as part of the problem. So we really need to start digging into this conversation, because as somebody was saying before, there is a North Star for energy, but there is no North Star for agriculture. That's what I heard at COP.
Heather?
Thank you. Yes, I think this question of North Stars is really key. We've got to move from big pledges into big action. Greta Thunberg is right about that. And actually moving things forward, even if it is through coalitions like the methane and the deforestation pledges, is key to show that progress is actually happening and to increase the credibility of the global north vis-a-vis the global south in this climate justice, as Olivia was just saying. It would be very important that Egypt itself take the leadership on the issue of food security, being a country which is very vulnerable, on being very dependent on food imports, and of course, because of the fragility of the whole food, the kind of interaction between government revenues and food availability in countries like Egypt. because we tend to think of food as being something that is provided through market, but in fact, in many countries, it's actually provided through the state. It's a good example of that. So focusing on how to ensure food security and water security during climate transition needs to be a key focus, because that's a way of getting at the system issue from a very practical, human-oriented way. So the public can see the importance of the benefits, and it provides a fundamental level of security that allows countries which are really at the edge of their capacity to provide for basic needs, make pledges and to see that climate finance won't only need, it needs to be unpacked, say, climate finance is not money to governments that disappears, but something that delivers on social and basic needs.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Heather. We are out of time, so we need to draw to a close. So thanks to Mark, Carla, Olivia, and Heather, to participants who submitted questions. Obviously, there's been a lot of debate and a lot written about the COP summit, so hopefully we've contributed something distinctive here this afternoon. By way of summary, I would say clearly that in many ways the summit sort of vindicates a lot of what the EU's already been doing on climate action, but perhaps also opens up some different kinds of questions, and should invite the EU to think in slightly different ways about how it modifies its policies in the next period going forward. And there's certainly issues that we will pick up in our own work in Carnegie. So having said all that, thank you to our speakers, to the participants, and we close the debate here. Good afternoon to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.